United States of America was born from the yearning of the many people who had traveled there from the old world of Europe to be free of the imperial powers that had dominated them for centuries, to have democracy, liberty, justice for all, and to take command of their own destiny. The birth of the American nation was a painful one, first by having to fight against the forces of the British and then against the indigenous people of North America, within and from the outside of new borders they had declared. In between the many conflicts, the new nation had to establish its own laws, political system, and culture, none of which developed overnight. Obviously, there would not always be a consensus. Over the century after 1776, when the United States of America was born, while growing under a political union of states that it was composed of, it also saw the widening of a cultural divide between the industrious northern states and the agricultural southern ones. Perhaps more than anything else, the two sides of this divide found themselves at odds over the question of slavery. The ethics of owning a person as property became a legal battle between those in support of the practice and those opposed in American courts and halls of power. Eventually, this dispute became a true battlefield. More Americans died in the American Civil War that raged in the North American continent between 1861 and 1865 than in any other war in which Americans have fought throughout its history. And while the battles have long endured, the ramifications of the Civil War continue to be felt to this very day in America over issues such as culture and race. Today, we delve into the darkest chapter of American history. The debate over slavery in America actually predates the Declaration of Independence itself. Under British rule, the American territories were separated into 13 colonies, and in one of these colonies, Rhode Island, laws were passed in 1774, making slavery illegal within its state boundaries. However, while many sympathized with the call for the abolition of slavery after 1776, slaves were still a major factor in the economies of many states, particularly in the South, where the main export was tobacco, and the use of slaves to harvest tobacco was seen as simply part of the natural order of things. That would change after April 1793, when American inventor Eli Whitney built the first cotton gin, a machine that quickly and easily separated cotton fibers from their seeds, enabling much greater productivity than previous manual cotton separation could achieve. Few could have known that Whitney's invention would have such an impact on the course of history beyond the production of cotton-based goods. In many ways, it was a somewhat humble spark that would eventually ignite the Civil War. Thanks to the cotton gin, the cotton trade grew exponentially in profitability, creating many fortunes for the landowners engaged in the trade, particularly in the South. American cotton became highly sought after, not just in their own country, but across the world, especially in the lucrative British market, making it a key American export, and port cities such as New Orleans in Louisiana and Charleston in South Carolina became major trading hubs, growing in size and wealth. A major factor in achieving this profitability was the use of slaves acquired from Africa to work the cotton fields. However, in the northernmost states, the economy was being fueled more by the advances made in industrialization and manufacturing. Like the cotton fields in the South, northern industry required large numbers of people to power it, but instead of importing slaves, the manpower was acquired through large numbers of immigrants, particularly from places such as Ireland, where a large percentage of the population felt enslaved by the British Crown. Consequently, as the immigrant population in the North grew on the dream of freedom, their calls for the abolition of all forms of slavery continued to grow. Meanwhile, America itself was growing by absorbing territory to the west. On April 30th, 1803, the vast expanse of land stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific was acquired by the United States from France for over $11 million, in what history now remembers as the Louisiana Purchase. This presented a problem regarding whether or not these new territories would utilize slaves like the South, or be so-called free states, such as in the North. On January 1st, 1808, the abolitionist movement won a key victory when the US federal government banned the import of fresh slaves from Africa. Consequently, in the northern states, slavery was slowly phased out, but for the southern states, this was unthinkable, and the ban on further imports of fresh slaves threatened to curtail their cotton industry, which was still expanding and relied heavily on slavery. The need for new slaves in the South would see a surge in the international trade of slaves in America between the North and South. The growing abolition of slavery also reinforced the cultural separation between the two sides of the debate, something that was exacerbated by the number of immigrants now in the North, leading many white Southern families who cherished their history in the birth of their nation to consider themselves the more American states. As new states were formed after the Louisiana Purchase, a delicate political balance between the North and South was maintained by admitting both slave and free states to the Union. However, the North had a significantly higher population than the South, many of whom wished to abolish slavery across the entire of the United States, and thus the North came to dominate the political landscape within the House of Representatives. Feeling threatened by this, the South sought to redress the balance in 1819, as Maine and Missouri petitioned for admission to the Union. The status of slaves in these would-be states became the topic of much debate and would likely affect future states joining the Union as the US expanded westward. After much deliberation, it was decided that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state and Maine as a free state, thus maintaining the political balance between the two sides of the debate. It was known as the Missouri Compromise, and it outlined that in the future, states north of Missouri and the 3630 latitude line would be admitted only if they had abolished slavery. While the compromise was precisely that, many observers at the time noted that the subject of slavery had divided the nation. There appeared no long-term solution that would satisfy either side, particularly as Southern cotton exports were still growing, as were their profits. Meanwhile, tensions with America's southern neighbor of Mexico, whose borders were significantly larger than they are today, encompassing the current American states of Texas and California, began to rise. In 1836, Texas broke away from Mexico, declaring itself an independent republic. But this resulted in both the Mexicans and Americans expressing ambitions of absorbing the new country into their own nations. In 1843, US President John Tyler decided to pursue a policy of annexing Texas as part of his bid for re-election. Officially, this was to outmaneuver suspected diplomatic efforts by the British government for the freeing of slaves in Texas, which would, he said, undermine slavery in the United States. Tyler's diplomats undertook secret negotiations with the Texas government in Houston, securing a treaty of annexation in April of 1844. When the documents were submitted to the US Senate for ratification, the details of the terms of the annexation became public, and the question of acquiring Texas took center stage in the presidential election of 1844, which was won by James K. Polk. Polk was a strong supporter for the annexation, and it was under his presidency on February 19, 1846, that Texas became the 28th state, although this sparked the two-year-long Mexican-American War. This war was a watershed in American history. Firstly, it helped solidify America as a true military power on the North American continent. And secondly, the acquisition of formerly Mexican territory reinforced the prevailing idea of America's manifest destiny. This was a widely held belief by the people of the United States that its population were destined by God to expand across the North American continent, bringing law, order, American institutions, and Christianity to the vast frontier. But while the war itself helped unify some of the divisions in American society, it was in the peace that followed that the divisions, particularly around slavery, not only re-emerged, but became inflamed. The United States now extended to the Pacific Ocean, and the question of slavery in the new territories was again a topic of debate. Both the North and the South maintained their respective views and wished to impose those views on Texas. Even before the war was concluded, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot proposed a ban on slavery in the new territories in the U.S.'s possession to the U.S. House of Representatives. Dubbed the Wilmot Proviso, it was ultimately defeated, but the debate continued on about what to do with the new territories and slavery. In an effort to address the division between the free states and the slave states, a package of